Faith is easy to talk about when life is predictable and comfortable, when prayers are answered quickly and outcomes align with expectations. Comfort allows faith to remain theoretical because it is never required to carry weight. Pressure is what turns faith from a belief into a lived reality. When circumstances apply force, faith is no longer measured by words but by responses. What you believe shows up in how you endure, how you obey, and how you trust when options disappear. Pressure exposes foundations. When everything is stable, weak faith and strong faith look the same. Both can sing, both can quote scripture, both can agree with truth, but when pressure arrives, only one stands. Pressure reveals whether faith is anchored in God's character or dependent on favorable conditions. Comfort hides cracks, but pressure makes them visible. That is why tests are necessary, because untested faith is unverified faith. God allows pressure not to break faith, but to reveal its authenticity. Faith that collapses under pressure was never built to carry responsibility. Pressure is not punishment, it is examination. It shows what faith is resting on. If faith rests on outcomes, it will fail when outcomes change. If faith rests on God, it will remain steady even when circumstances contradict the promise. Pressure removes distractions. In comfort, faith can be casual. In pressure, faith becomes focused. When resources are limited and answers delayed, attention shifts. Dependence becomes clearer. Priorities are reordered. Faith moves from convenience to necessity. What was once optional becomes essential. Prayer deepens. Trust becomes intentional. Obedience becomes costly. Pressure forces faith to grow roots instead of branches. Faith proven under pressure is not loud, but it is consistent. It does not always feel confident, but it remains committed. Pressure does not eliminate fear. It reveals whether fear controls decisions. Faith proven under pressure continues to obey even when emotions resist. It continues to trust even when logic argues otherwise. It continues to stand even when progress is slow and clarity is limited. Comfort allows faith to remain unchallenged, but pressure demands choice. Every pressured moment asks a question: will you trust God or trust relief? Will you obey God or escape discomfort? Will you believe God or believe circumstances? Faith is proven not by how much you know, but by what you choose when obedience costs you something tangible. Pressure also reveals maturity. Immature faith seeks immediate rescue. Mature faith seeks alignment. Immature faith asks when the pressure will end. Mature faith asks what God is producing. Pressure teaches faith to value transformation over timing. It shifts focus from removal of difficulty to development through difficulty. This is where faith deepens beyond emotion and becomes conviction. God often uses pressure to prepare faith for promotion. Increased responsibility requires increased trust. Greater influence demands deeper dependence. Pressure develops endurance, humility, and discernment. These qualities cannot be taught in comfort because comfort does not require them. Pressure trains faith to remain steady when outcomes are uncertain and support is limited. Faith proven in pressure becomes resilient. It learns to absorb shock without losing direction. It learns to bend without breaking. It learns to rest in God rather than rush towards solutions. Pressure teaches faith to distinguish between what feels urgent and what is truly important. It refines focus and strengthens resolve. When faith survives pressure, it gains authority. It becomes credible, not just confessed. It carries weight because it has been tested. Faith that has endured pressure speaks differently. It no longer needs constant reassurance. It trusts God's nature even when God's actions are not immediately visible. It understands that God is working beyond what can be seen or explained. Pressure also purifies motives. It reveals why you believe. If faith exists only for blessings, pressure will weaken it. If faith exists for relationship, pressure will deepen it. Pressure removes shallow expectations and replaces them with surrendered trust. It teaches faith to rest in who God is, not just what God does. Faith proven in pressure does not rush God or resent Him. It waits without walking away. It questions without quitting. It hopes without evidence. It obeys without guarantees. Pressure turns faith from a temporary response into a permanent posture, shaping how you think, decide, and move even when relief has not yet arrived. God's silence is one of the greatest tests of faith because we often confuse silence with absence. When God does not speak, explain, or intervene on our timeline, the natural assumption is that He has stepped away. But silence does not mean separation, and delay does not mean desertion. God can be deeply present even when He is not verbally active. Faith is stretched in these moments because it must rely on trust rather than confirmation. Silence removes emotional reassurance. When God speaks clearly, faith feels supported. When God is silent, faith must stand alone. This is where belief moves from dependence on signals to dependence on character. You are no longer trusting what God says in the moment, but who God has proven himself to be over time. Silence asks whether past faithfulness is enough to sustain present trust. God's silence often shifts responsibility. When instructions are clear, obedience feels guided. When silence comes, obedience becomes intentional. You must choose to continue doing what you know is right without new affirmation. Faith matures here because it learns to operate from conviction rather than constant direction. Silence tests whether you require continual instruction or whether truth has already taken root. Silence also exposes what faith is anchored to. If faith depends on emotional experiences, silence feels threatening. If faith depends on visible movement, silence feels discouraging. But if faith is anchored in relationship, silence becomes a space of growth rather than fear. God's silence often invites deeper seeking, not abandonment. It draws faith inward rather than outward. Many people mistake silence for rejection because they equate love with activity. But love does not always speak loudly. Sometimes love trusts you enough to be quiet. God's silence can mean he believes you are ready to walk without holding your hand every step. Faith grows when it learns to move forward with wisdom rather than waiting for constant reassurance. Silence refines listening. When God is not speaking audibly, distractions become louder. Competing voices rise. Fear speaks, doubt speaks, memory speaks. Silence forces faith to discern which voices carry authority. It teaches faith to filter thoughts through truth rather than emotion. This discernment strengthens spiritual awareness and reduces dependence on external validation. God's silence also develops patience. Waiting without explanation stretches endurance. Faith learns to remain steady without rushing God or forcing outcomes. Silence removes the illusion of control and replaces it with surrender. You learn to trust that God sees what you cannot and knows what you do not. Faith matures when it accepts that understanding is not always required for obedience. Silence does not stop God's work. While you hear nothing, God is often arranging, aligning, and preparing things beyond your visibility. Faith must believe in unseen activity. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. God works in dimensions faith cannot monitor. Silence trains faith to trust beyond sight and beyond sound. Silence reveals emotional attachment to outcomes. When answers are delayed, impatience surfaces. Expectations are challenged. Faith is refined as motives are exposed. You begin to examine whether you trust God only when outcomes align with desires. Silence removes transactional faith and invites relational faith where trust is not dependent on results. God's silence often strengthens prayer. When quick answers are unavailable, prayer deepens. Requests turn into conversations. Demands turn into surrender. Faith learns to remain connected even when resolution is distant. Silence purifies communication by removing entitlement and increasing humility. Faith that survives silence becomes resilient. It no longer panics when heaven feels quiet. It understands that God's presence is not measured by volume. Silence becomes familiar rather than frightening. Faith learns to rest, wait, and continue without losing confidence. God's silence does not cancel his promises. It prepares faith to receive them without misusing them. Silence teaches restraint, wisdom, and trust. Faith that endures silence gains depth and stability. It becomes anchored rather than reactive, grounded rather than anxious, confident rather than demanding, continuing forward even when the voice it longs for is momentarily quiet. Obedience is the most honest expression of faith because it moves belief from intention into action. Faith can exist in thought, emotion, and language, but obedience requires movement. It demands response. Anyone can say they believe, but obedience answers the question of how much that belief truly governs behavior. When faith is deep, obedience follows naturally, even when it is uncomfortable or costly. Faith that remains unexpressed through obedience is incomplete. Belief alone does not demonstrate trust, action does. Obedience proves that faith is not just agreement with truth, but submission to it. When God speaks and action follows, faith is visible. When God speaks and hesitation follows, faith is revealed as shallow or conflicted. Obedience does not wait for certainty, it acts on conviction. The depth of faith is revealed most clearly when obedience carries risk. Easy obedience does not require faith, it requires convenience. True faith is shown when obedience demands sacrifice, patience, or vulnerability. When obedience threatens comfort, reputation, or control, faith is measured. The deeper the faith, the greater the willingness to obey without guarantees. Obedience exposes trust levels. If faith trusts God fully, obedience feels aligned even when outcomes are unknown. If faith is partial, obedience becomes selective. People obey where it feels safe and resist where it feels costly. This selectivity reveals the limits of faith. Deep faith obeys fully, not because it understands everything, but because it trusts God's character more than its own reasoning. Obedience also reveals whose voice carries authority. When multiple influences compete, the one obeyed is the one believed. Faith is not proven by what you agree with, but by what you submit to. When God's instruction conflicts with logic, emotion, or social pressure, obedience shows which voice faith considers final. Depth of faith is measured by obedience under contradiction. Delayed obedience exposes shallow faith. When faith is deep, obedience is immediate because trust is settled. When faith is shallow, obedience is postponed until clarity improves or risk decreases. Delay is often disguised as wisdom, but it frequently reflects fear. Deep faith does not require all variables to be resolved. It steps forward trusting God to handle what obedience cannot control. Obedience strengthens faith as much as it reveals it. Every act of obedience reinforces trust. Each step taken without full understanding increases confidence in God's faithfulness. Obedience becomes a training ground where faith grows stronger through practice. Faith that is never exercised remains theoretical. Faith that is obeyed becomes resilient. Obedience also exposes dependence. When outcomes are uncertain, obedience requires reliance on God beyond self-effort. Deep faith understands that obedience does not guarantee ease, but it guarantees alignment. Obedience shifts responsibility from control to trust. It accepts that results belong to God while response belongs to the believer. The depth of faith determines endurance in obedience. Shallow faith obeys briefly and retreats when resistance appears. Deep faith continues even when progress is slow and affirmation is absent. Obedience sustained over time reflects a settled trust that does not require constant reinforcement. This consistency reveals maturity. Obedience clarifies faith's foundation. If faith is built on blessing, obedience collapses when blessing is delayed. If faith is built on relationship, obedience remains steady regardless of outcome. Deep faith obeys because of who God is, not because of what God gives. It remains anchored even when obedience leads through difficulty rather than deliverance. Obedience also aligns faith with purpose. God often reveals direction progressively, requiring obedience at each step. Faith that obeys moves forward. Faith that hesitates remains stuck. Depth of faith determines momentum. Obedience unlocks movement not by forcing outcomes, but by aligning actions with divine order. Obedience reshapes identity. Each obedient act reinforces the belief that God is trustworthy and that surrender is safe. Over time, obedience becomes less forced and more natural. Faith deepens as trust becomes habitual. Obedience transforms faith from belief into lifestyle, from momentary decision into consistent posture, revealing a faith that is rooted, active, and fully engaged even when the path ahead remains uncertain and the cost of obedience continues to challenge comfort. Logic and control. Waiting seasons are one of God's primary tools for building spiritual strength because waiting removes shortcuts and exposes reliance. When movement slows and answers are delayed, faith is no longer supported by momentum. Strength is developed not by speed, but by endurance, and endurance can only be formed when there is something to endure. Waiting creates resistance, and resistance is necessary for growth. Spiritual strength is not built in moments of immediate fulfillment. Quick results may bring relief, but they rarely build depth. Waiting requires sustained trust. And sustained trust strengthens faith muscles that instant answers never touch. In waiting, you learn how to remain faithful without feedback, how to continue believing without visible progress, and how to hold on when emotions fluctuate. This persistence is the foundation of spiritual strength. Waiting strips away control. When outcomes are delayed, self-reliance weakens. You realize that effort alone cannot accelerate divine timing. This surrender is uncomfortable, but it is formative. Spiritual strength grows when dependence shifts from self to God. Waiting teaches faith to lean rather than push, to trust rather than force. Strength is formed when faith learns how to rest without becoming passive. Waiting seasons develop patience, but not passive patience. They teach active patience where obedience continues even when results do not. You keep praying, you keep obeying, you keep trusting. This kind of patience trains the soul to remain steady under uncertainty. It prevents faith from being reactionary and shapes it into something consistent and resilient. Waiting also refines focus. When nothing seems to change externally, attention turns inward. Motives are examined. Desires are clarified. You begin to see what you want versus what you need. Spiritual strength grows as distractions lose their grip and priorities realign. Waiting simplifies faith by removing noise and sharpening discernment. During waiting, God often builds character before granting change. Strength without character leads to instability. Waiting allows God to shape humility, discipline, and wisdom. These traits cannot be rushed because they are learned through repetition and restraint. Waiting trains faith to choose obedience repeatedly without external rewards, strengthening integrity and resolve. Waiting teaches faith to manage disappointment. Expectations are challenged, timelines collapse, and assumptions are corrected. Spiritual strength grows when faith learns how to process disappointment without becoming bitter. Waiting trains the heart to release entitlement and embrace trust. It teaches faith to remain soft rather than cynical, hopeful rather than hardened. Waiting seasons also strengthen prayer life. When quick answers are unavailable, prayer deepens. Conversations replace requests. Listening replaces demanding. Faith becomes relational rather than transactional. This deepened connection strengthens spiritual awareness and intimacy with God. Strength grows as faith learns to stay connected even when circumstances remain unchanged. Waiting exposes emotional triggers, impatience, anxiety, comparison, and doubts surface more clearly when progress is slow. Spiritual strength grows as faith learns to confront these responses rather than be ruled by them. Waiting provides the space to practice self-control, emotional regulation, and trust. These skills strengthen faith for future challenges. Waiting teaches faith to value alignment over arrival. You begin to care more about being positioned correctly than arriving quickly. Spiritual strength grows as faith learns that timing matters as much as outcome. Rushed blessings can damage what waiting would have protected. Strength is developed when faith trusts God's pace rather than demanding its own. Waiting prepares faith for responsibility. What you are waiting for often carries weight. Without strength, that weight could overwhelm you. Waiting allows capacity to grow. Faith becomes more stable, more discerning, more grounded. Strength increases quietly as faith learns how to carry pressure without collapsing. Waiting also trains faith to recognize God's presence without visible movement. You learn to trust that God is working even when nothing appears to change. This confidence strengthens spiritual vision. Faith learns to see beyond sight and trust beyond evidence. Strength is formed as faith becomes less dependent on confirmation and more anchored in truth. Waiting seasons do not weaken faith, they fortify it. They produce depth, stability, and resilience. Spiritual strength formed in waiting does not fade when circumstances shift. It remains steady, grounded, and durable, capable of carrying purpose, sustaining obedience, and enduring pressure without losing trust, direction, or commitment to God even when fulfillment remains just beyond reach. Passing the test is never just about surviving difficulty. It is about preparation for responsibility. God does not test faith to see if you will fail, but to shape you so you can handle what is coming next. The promise ahead carries weight, and without preparation, that weight could crush rather than bless. The test is not a delay tactic, it is a positioning process. Every promise requires capacity. Passing the test expands that capacity internally before the promise manifests externally. God is more concerned with who you are becoming than what you are receiving. Tests stretch patience, deepen trust, and refine obedience so that when the promise arrives, you are stable enough to sustain it. Without testing, blessings can become burdens and opportunities can become liabilities. Passing the test proves readiness. Readiness is not about perfection, it is about alignment. When faith remains steady under pressure, God knows direction will remain steady under blessing. Tests reveal whether faith is rooted or reactive. A reactive faith may celebrate the promise but mishandle it. A rooted faith carries the promise with wisdom, humility, and gratitude. Tests expose motives. When faith endures hardship without abandoning trust, motives become purified. The desire shifts from receiving something from God to walking with God. This shift is crucial because promises are safest in the hands of those who value relationship over reward. Passing the test confirms that faith is not transactional but relational. God often hides the promise behind the test because the test produces the mindset required to steward it. Authority without humility creates arrogance. Provision without discipline creates waste. Influence without character creates compromise. Tests remove these risks by developing restraint, discernment, and dependence. Passing the test ensures the promise does not damage what God has built. Passing the test also aligns timing. God's promises are not just about arrival, but about sequence. Releasing a promise too early can disrupt growth. Tests synchronize faith with divine timing so that when the promise unfolds, it does so at the right moment, in the right way, with the right impact. Passing the test brings faith into rhythm with God's order. The test reveals obedience under pressure. Promises often require obedience beyond comfort. Passing the test demonstrates that obedience is not conditional on convenience. God entrusts promises to those who obey when it is costly, because they are more likely to obey when it is beneficial. Passing the test shows that faith is governed by trust, not circumstance. Passing the test also builds resilience. Promises do not eliminate challenges, they introduce new ones. Without resilience, the pressure that follows promotion can overwhelm faith. Tests strengthen endurance so faith can handle future resistance without retreating. Passing the test prepares faith to remain stable even when responsibility increases. Tests clarify identity. During testing, false identities fall away. You learn who you are apart from success, recognition, or results. This clarity is essential before receiving a promise, because identity rooted in God prevents misuse of what God gives. Passing the test confirms that faith is grounded in truth, not achievement. God positions people through tests. The environment you pass through prepares you for the environment you are entering. Tests teach navigation, discernment, and wisdom. Passing the test equips faith with experience, not just knowledge. Experience becomes a guide when new levels introduce unfamiliar pressure. Passing the test strengthens spiritual authority. Authority flows from trust built through obedience. When faith remains intact through difficulty, it gains credibility. That credibility carries influence. God often releases promises through people whose faith has been tested because tested faith carries weight and impact. Passing the test reshapes expectations. You stop expecting ease and start expecting God's presence. This shift prepares faith for promises that require ongoing trust rather than one-time celebration. Passing the test teaches faith to manage success without losing dependence. The promise is not the reward for passing the test. Readiness is. The promise flows naturally once readiness is complete. God positions faith through testing so that when the promise arrives, it fits, functions, and fulfills purpose without destroying peace, integrity, or trust, allowing the promise to be carried with wisdom, humility, strength, and unwavering dependence on God rather than self.